The person you love just walked away from someone very important. And you'll be surprised to find out who it was. While you were trying to convince yourself that nothing unusual was happening, a door quietly closed somewhere far away. No loud argument. No dramatic goodbye. No desperate attempt to stop what was unfolding. Just silence. The kind of silence that only appears after a decision has already been made. The person you love stood there for several seconds without speaking, staring at someone whose presence had shaped countless choices over the years. Neither of them moved. Neither of them looked away. It almost seemed as though time itself refused to continue until one of them finally accepted what was already true. Then, without warning, your name entered the conversation. Softly. Carefully. Almost as if saying it too loudly would change everything. The room became impossibly still. And in that moment, something happened that nobody expected. The other person leaned forward, convinced that this would be another conversation ending the same way all the previous ones had. They expected hesitation. They expected compromise. They expected fear. Instead, they saw something unfamiliar growing inside the eyes of the person you love. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It was certainty. Quiet certainty. The kind that cannot be argued with because it wasn't born from emotion. It had been forming for weeks, maybe months, hidden beneath ordinary conversations, polite smiles, and carefully chosen words. Long before anyone else realized a change was happening, that transformation had already begun. But nobody understood why. Not yet. Somewhere deep inside, memories were colliding. Every promise ever made. Every sacrifice. Every expectation carried like invisible weight across the years. The person standing across from them represented more than a relationship. They represented history itself. Shared victories. Painful disappointments. Familiar routines that had slowly become invisible chains. Walking away from someone like that wasn't simply ending a conversation. It meant abandoning a version of themselves they had lived with for longer than anyone knew. And yet, they didn't look frightened anymore. The strange part wasn't that they chose to leave. The strange part was what happened immediately before they turned toward the door. They smiled. Not with happiness. With peace. A peaceful expression that confused the other person more than any argument ever could. Because peaceful people don't usually disappear without explanation. Peaceful people stay. They negotiate. They apologize. But this peace came from somewhere deeper. Somewhere untouched by guilt. That frightened the other person far more than tears ever would have. Outside, nothing appeared different. Cars continued passing. People laughed somewhere nearby. Someone walked a dog without realizing an invisible chapter of several lives had just ended forever. The world never pauses for private revolutions. Yet unseen decisions often change futures more than public celebrations ever could. This was one of those moments. Hidden. Ordinary to everyone else. Extraordinary to those whose lives were about to intersect because of it. But something even stranger happened after the door closed. Instead of feeling relief, the person left behind whispered one question into the empty room. Was it because of them? There was no answer. Only silence. Yet silence sometimes reveals more than words. Because they already knew exactly who them was. They knew. And that realization changed everything. Far away, without realizing why, you suddenly felt distracted. Maybe you looked away from your phone. Maybe you paused in the middle of a conversation. Maybe you stared through a window longer than usual. Nothing dramatic. Just one of those mysterious moments where your thoughts drift somewhere they were never invited. You couldn't explain it. There wasn't any logical reason. Yet something inside you quietly insisted that an invisible chapter had just opened. Human hearts often notice changes long before human minds understand them. At almost the exact same time, the person you love found themselves standing alone beneath an evening sky that looked strangely unfamiliar despite being the same sky they had seen every day. Freedom doesn't always arrive with excitement. Sometimes it arrives carrying uncertainty. Sometimes the first feeling after choosing yourself isn't joy. It's terrifying silence. The silence that asks whether you truly meant what you just did. They closed their eyes. One memory appeared. Not the face they had just left behind. Yours. That surprised even them. Because they hadn't been trying to think about you. Your memory simply arrived without permission. Not loudly. Quietly. Like sunlight entering through curtains no one remembered opening. They remembered a conversation with you that probably seemed insignificant at the time. A simple sentence. A passing comment. Something almost forgettable. Yet somehow those ordinary words had remained alive inside them long after every louder voice had disappeared. Funny how truth rarely announces itself. It simply waits until someone becomes brave enough to recognize it. Then another memory surfaced. A moment when someone had warned them against becoming too attached to you. At the time they laughed. Now they understood why that warning had been given. Not because loving you was dangerous. Because loving you made pretending impossible. And pretending had become the foundation upon which several important relationships quietly depended. Nobody had expected authenticity to become the greatest threat. Least of all the person who had just been left behind. Meanwhile, another conversation was beginning somewhere else. Two people who believed they understood the situation discussed what had happened. One insisted it couldn't possibly last. They always come back. The other wasn't so certain. This feels different. Why? Because this time they didn't leave angry. What difference does that make? It makes all the difference. Silence. Then the second person added something almost nobody else would have noticed. They stopped trying to convince anyone. That observation settled heavily between them. People argue when they still hope to be understood. People explain themselves when they still seek permission. But those who have finally accepted their own truth often leave without exhausting another sentence. That frightened them. Because deep inside, they realized they might already be too late. Still, nobody fully understood the hidden reason behind this unexpected decision. Everyone assumed it was about conflict. About disappointment. About exhaustion. Only one person suspected something entirely different. An elderly woman who had quietly watched these relationships unfold for years looked toward the empty chair where the person you love usually sat. She smiled sadly. Then she whispered almost to herself. They finally remembered. Nobody heard her clearly. Someone asked what she meant. She simply shook her head. It's not my story to tell. The conversation moved on. But those mysterious words refused to disappear. Remembered what? What had been forgotten? Who had hidden it? Why did walking away suddenly resemble waking up? Questions multiplied faster than answers. Meanwhile, your evening continued as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet tiny details began behaving differently. A song you hadn't heard in years unexpectedly started playing. Someone mentioned a place connected to an old memory. A stranger smiled at you for no obvious reason before continuing on their way. None of these events meant anything individually. Together, however, they formed something impossible to ignore. It almost felt as though invisible threads had begun pulling distant moments toward one another. The person you love wasn't experiencing coincidence either. Everywhere they looked, familiar reminders unexpectedly appeared. Not reminders of the person they had just left. Reminders connected to you. A street. A phrase. A photograph. Even a scent carried by the wind. It became impossible to escape. Not because the world had changed. Because they had. Perspective quietly rearranges reality. The same places suddenly tell different stories once the heart decides to listen. That realization unsettled them more than they wanted to admit. They wondered whether leaving had actually been the beginning rather than the ending. But another hidden truth was approaching. One that had been waiting patiently beneath years of misunderstanding. Late that night, someone unexpectedly knocked on the door of the person who had been left behind. They weren't expecting visitors. The door opened. Standing there was someone nobody thought would become involved. They entered without wasting time. "I think you deserve the truth." Those words immediately changed the atmosphere. The truth about what? The reason they left. They told you? No. Then how could you know? Because I watched it happen long before either of you noticed. Silence stretched across the room. Then the visitor carefully placed an old envelope onto the table. It had never been opened. Its edges had faded with time. Someone reached toward it before hesitating. What is this? A choice that was never allowed to happen. The room felt colder. Hands trembled. The envelope remained unopened. For several endless seconds nobody dared move. Finally, it was turned over. On the back, only one handwritten sentence appeared. "If this ever reaches you, everything has already changed." Nobody spoke. Nobody breathed. Because suddenly they realized this wasn't merely about one relationship ending. Something much older had quietly returned. Something that had been hidden for years. And somewhere, completely unaware that your own life was moving toward the center of this mystery, your phone lit up with a notification from someone you never expected to hear from again. But before you could open it, another message appeared first. One sentence. No name. No explanation. Just 7 unforgettable words. They finally walked away because they chose you. They finally walked away because they chose you. Those 7 words refused to behave like an ordinary message. They didn't simply appear on the screen. They seemed to settle somewhere much deeper, as though they had been waiting for the exact second when every hidden decision had already been made. Before you could even wonder who had sent them, the notification disappeared. Not deleted. Not recalled. Simply gone. You checked again. Nothing. No sender. No conversation. No trace that it had ever existed. Yet you knew exactly what you had read. The words remained perfectly clear inside your mind, impossible to dismiss as imagination. For several long moments you simply stared at the empty screen, wondering whether the message had reached the wrong person or whether someone intended you to read it without ever proving it had existed at all. Somewhere else, the person you love experienced almost the same feeling. They sat alone in complete silence, unable to stop thinking about the envelope that had remained unopened. They had no idea another conversation was quietly unfolding around something connected to their past, but an unexplainable restlessness settled over them. Every instinct urged them to turn around. To go back. To ask questions they had never thought to ask before. Yet another part of them whispered that the answers would not be found by returning to what they had already left behind. They would only be found by moving towards something they had spent years avoiding. The person who had delivered the envelope watched every expression crossing the face of the one left behind. There was confusion first. Then irritation. Then disbelief. Finally, fear. Real fear. Not because of what the envelope contained, but because of what it represented. The visitor quietly said, "Open it." The reply came immediately. "I don't want to know." The visitor nodded slowly, almost expecting those words. "That's exactly why it has remained sealed for all these years." Silence returned. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the windows as though the night itself had decided to stay and listen. The envelope rested between them like something alive. Neither person touched it. Yet both understood that nothing could continue until someone finally faced what had been hidden inside. Across town, another conversation had already begun without anyone realizing how important it would become. An older man sat across from someone who had known the person you love since childhood. Neither had spoken for months. Their meeting had not been planned. It happened because one happened to enter a quiet cafe while the other was preparing to leave. They recognized each other immediately. After exchanging a few polite words, one simple question unexpectedly changed the direction of the evening. "Have you heard what happened?" The other looked surprised. "You mean, they finally left?" The first nodded. Neither smiled. Neither seemed shocked. Instead, both carried the strange expression of people who had watched something inevitable slowly approaching for years. One finally whispered, "I always wondered how long they could keep pretending." The second answered without hesitation. "Longer than anyone else believed." Then came another silence, heavier than the first, because both secretly knew pretending had never been the real problem. The real problem had been why they felt forced to pretend in the first place. Meanwhile, your thoughts refused to settle. The mysterious message replayed over and over until it almost felt unreal. You tried convincing yourself it meant nothing. Perhaps someone was joking. Perhaps it had been sent to the wrong number. Perhaps exhaustion was making ordinary coincidences appear meaningful. But deep inside, another possibility quietly refused to disappear. What if someone had wanted you to know something before anyone else? What if the message had never been meant to start a conversation? What if it had simply been a warning that events already unfolding would soon reach you whether you were prepared or not? The questions multiplied until even the silence around you felt different. You walked toward the nearest window without realizing you had done so. The night looked ordinary. Yet something inside insisted the world had already changed. At that exact moment, the envelope was finally opened. The hands holding it shook almost imperceptibly. There was no dramatic music. No hidden photographs falling across the table. Just a single folded letter written years earlier. The ink had faded slightly, but every word remained perfectly readable. Before reading aloud, the person who had been left behind looked at the visitor one final time. "Who wrote this?" The answer arrived quietly. The one person everyone believed never understood what was happening. Slowly the letter unfolded. The first line caused immediate confusion. It did not begin with a greeting. It began with an apology. "I'm sorry that everyone keeps protecting the wrong people." The room instantly fell silent. The sentence was so unexpected that neither person moved for several seconds. They continued reading. Every paragraph quietly dismantled assumptions that had survived for years. It described conversations that had never been mentioned. Decisions made behind closed doors. Moments when truth had almost surfaced before being buried beneath convenient explanations. Then one sentence stopped everything. "If they ever leave, it will not be because they stopped loving someone. It will be because they finally started loving themselves enough to stop living someone else's future." The person reading lowered the letter. Their breathing changed. The visitor noticed immediately. "You didn't know, did you?" No answer came. The visitor continued. "None of you knew." Still silence. Finally, the reader whispered, "Who else has seen this?" The reply arrived like another quiet shock. "Only me." "Why wait all these years?" The visitor looked toward the rain. "Because they weren't ready to believe it before tonight." Those words settled heavily over the room. Sometimes truth arrives early but cannot be received. Sometimes the right answer spends years waiting for the right version of a person to discover it. Not far away, the person you love found themselves driving without choosing a destination. Every traffic light felt strangely familiar. Every turn seemed guided by memory rather than intention. They eventually stopped near a place they had not visited in years. It wasn't connected to the relationship they had ended. It was connected to you. They stepped out slowly, surprised that their feet had carried them there almost automatically. The building looked unchanged. The trees swayed gently in the night breeze. For several minutes they simply stood there remembering one ordinary conversation that had never felt important until now. You had once said something so simple they nearly forgot it the moment they heard it. The people who truly care about you should never require you to become someone else. At the time they smiled politely. Tonight those words echoed louder than every argument they had experienced since. Then something unexpected happened. A familiar voice called their name. They turned. Standing several meters away was someone they never imagined seeing again. Not an old partner. Not a relative. Someone else entirely. A quiet observer who had witnessed years of complicated relationships without ever interfering. They approached slowly and smiled with surprising warmth. "I wondered how long it would take." The person you love looked confused. "How long what would take?" The stranger answered, "For you to stop running from the only decision your heart had already made." Those words landed with astonishing force. "You knew? Long before you did. Why didn't you say anything?" The stranger's smile faded slightly. Because advice given before someone is ready usually becomes another voice they learn to ignore. Back inside the cafe, the two old acquaintances continued talking. One leaned closer and quietly admitted something almost unbelievable. "Do you remember the gathering 3 years ago?" The other nodded. "Everyone remembers it. Not everyone remembers what happened after everyone else left." Curiosity instantly replaced calm. "What happened?" The answer came carefully. The person you love asked one question. "What question?" "What if I've been trying to earn acceptance from people who already decided I would never deserve it?" Neither spoke for several moments after hearing those words. Finally the second person whispered, I never knew they asked that. Almost nobody did. What answer were they given? The first looked down at the table before replying. None. Everyone changed the subject. Some questions don't disappear simply because they remain unanswered. They become quieter. They settle beneath years of daily life. Then one ordinary evening they suddenly return, demanding an answer that can no longer be postponed. You still had no idea any of these conversations were happening. Yet another unexpected message appeared. This time it remained. No mysterious disappearance. No hidden sender. Just a location. No explanation. Beneath it were 5 simple words. If you want the truth. Your heartbeat quickened. You checked the address twice. It felt strangely familiar, though you couldn't immediately remember why. Before deciding whether to ignore it, another notification appeared. It wasn't from the same number. It came from someone you hadn't heard from in a very long time. They asked one ordinary question. Are you free tomorrow evening? Under normal circumstances you would have answered without hesitation. Tonight, however, the timing felt impossible to ignore. Elsewhere, the visitor carefully took back the old letter and placed it inside the envelope again. There's something I haven't told you. The person who had been left behind looked up immediately. There's more? Much more. Then tell me. The visitor hesitated. I can only tell you one part. Why? The answer came almost as a whisper. Because the rest doesn't belong to me. Who does it belong to? The visitor met their eyes. The person who still doesn't know they're already standing in the middle of this story. The room became perfectly still. Because at that exact same moment, someone quietly placed another envelope through your front door. Someone quietly placed another envelope through your front door. There was no knock. No footsteps rushing away. No sound except the soft scrape of paper sliding across the floor before complete silence returned. For several seconds you simply stared at it from across the room, almost expecting whoever had delivered it to knock again. They never did. Slowly you walked closer. The envelope was completely plain. No stamp. No address. No name. Just your initials written in careful handwriting that somehow felt strangely familiar without allowing you to remember exactly where you had seen it before. You reached down, picked it up, and immediately noticed something unusual. It wasn't sealed. Whoever had left it wanted you to open it without hesitation. Yet your fingers refused to move. A strange feeling settled over you, as though opening this envelope would quietly divide your life into 2 chapters, everything before this moment, and everything after it. At almost the same time, the person you love was sitting on a park bench they hadn't visited in years. The stranger who had unexpectedly found them had already disappeared, leaving behind only one sentence that continued echoing in their mind. Some journeys don't begin when you meet the right person. They begin when you finally stop listening to the wrong voices. They repeated those words again and again until they began remembering moments that had once seemed meaningless. Small conversations. Strange warnings. Gentle encouragements they had ignored because they didn't fit the version of life everyone expected them to live. Suddenly those forgotten moments started connecting like scattered pieces of a picture that had remained unfinished for years. Every memory pointed toward the same uncomfortable realization. They had never truly been choosing between 2 people. They had been choosing between 2 futures. Back in the room where the old letter had been opened, the visitor remained standing near the window. The person left behind had not spoken for several minutes. Their eyes remained fixed on the folded paper resting on the table. Finally they asked the question they had been avoiding from the beginning. Did they ever love me? The visitor answered without cruelty and without hesitation. Yes. Relief appeared for the briefest moment before disappearing again. Then why leave? The visitor took a slow breath. Because love alone cannot survive where truth isn't allowed to breathe. The words landed heavily. I gave them everything. The visitor gently shook their head. No. You gave them everything except the freedom to become themselves. That sentence shattered every explanation they had been repeating to themselves since the door had closed. For the first time, they stopped searching for someone else to blame. Meanwhile, you finally unfolded the paper inside the mysterious envelope. It contained only one handwritten page. No signature. No greeting. The first sentence immediately stopped your breathing. If you are reading this, then someone finally found the courage to walk away from the life they were expected to live. Your eyes raced across the page. Every line seemed written by someone who knew far more about your life than should have been possible. It spoke about invisible pressure. About quiet sacrifices. About people who smile while slowly abandoning pieces of themselves simply to keep everyone else comfortable. Then came another sentence that felt almost impossible. You think this story is about someone choosing you. It isn't. It's about someone finally choosing the truth, and the truth simply happened to lead toward you. You lowered the page and looked around the room, almost expecting someone to be watching. There wasn't another person in sight. Yet for the first time, you began wondering whether this entire chain of events had started long before today. What if this wasn't a sudden decision? What if dozens of invisible moments had quietly prepared everything now unfolding? The idea refused to leave your mind. Far away, another conversation was taking place inside a quiet house where an elderly woman sat alone with an old wooden box she hadn't opened in years. She carefully lifted the lid and removed several faded photographs. None of them showed celebrations. None showed dramatic events. They captured ordinary afternoons, shared meals, peaceful walks, and quiet conversations. She smiled softly while looking at one particular photograph where the person you love stood laughing at something outside the frame. Her finger rested gently on the picture before she whispered, "You were happiest before everyone started telling you who you should become." Tears filled her eyes, not from regret alone, but from finally understanding something she had overlooked for far too long. Sometimes the people who care about us unintentionally become the loudest voices pulling us away from ourselves. She reached beneath the photographs and found another folded paper. Unlike the first letter, this one had never been hidden. It had simply been forgotten. She unfolded it carefully. It contained a list written years earlier in familiar handwriting. At the top were 4 words. Things I never said. Beneath them appeared sentence after sentence that had never been spoken aloud. I'm afraid they'll stop loving me if I disappoint them. I don't know which dreams are truly mine anymore. Every time I imagine a different future, I somehow see the same person standing there. The elderly woman's hands trembled. She already knew whose handwriting she was reading. But the final sentence left her speechless. If I ever become brave enough to leave, I hope they understand it was never because they weren't important. It was because I finally realized someone else had quietly become irreplaceable. Elsewhere, the 2 old acquaintances met again outside the cafe after finishing their conversation. Neither seemed eager to leave. One suddenly asked, "Do you remember the night the lights went out during the community gathering?" The other laughed softly. Everyone remembers sitting in darkness for nearly 20 minutes. Not everyone remembers what happened while nobody could see. Curiosity returned immediately. What happened? The answer came almost reluctantly. Someone confessed something they believed would remain hidden forever because they thought nobody knew who was speaking. What did they say? The older man looked toward the empty street before answering. They said they were terrified of becoming successful at a life they never truly wanted. Silence followed. Then he added quietly, "I recognized the voice immediately." Did anyone else? No. Did you tell them later? No. Why? Because sometimes people aren't ready to hear that they've already spoken their deepest truth. As these forgotten memories resurfaced one after another, the person you love found themselves returning to a small bridge overlooking a calm river. They had visited it during difficult moments for years without ever admitting why. Tonight they leaned against the railing and watched reflections ripple across the water. Suddenly footsteps approached from behind. They turned, expecting another stranger. Instead, they froze. Standing before them was someone who had once influenced nearly every major decision of their life. This wasn't the person they had walked away from. This was someone even more unexpected. Someone whose approval they had spent years chasing without realizing it. Neither spoke immediately. Finally the older figure smiled sadly and broke the silence. "I heard what happened." The person you love nodded once. "Then you probably think I made a mistake." To their surprise, the older figure shook their head. "No." Confusion appeared instantly. "Then why are you here?" The answer arrived with quiet honesty. "To apologize." The wind seemed to stop. "For what?" "For teaching you that being loved had to be earned." Neither moved. The apology was so unexpected that it seemed impossible to answer. "I thought I was preparing you for life," the older figure continued. "Instead, I taught you to fear disappointing everyone." The person you love looked away. "I spent years trying to become enough." "I know. I never was." "You already were." Those 4 words carried more weight than years of advice. For the first time in a very long while, they cried. Not because someone had hurt them. Because someone had finally stopped pretending they hadn't. Across town, you unfolded the second sheet hidden beneath the first. Somehow you hadn't noticed it before. Unlike the handwritten page, this one contained only a simple map. One location had been circled in dark ink. At the bottom, another sentence waited. Tomorrow. Sunset. Come only if you're ready to discover why several people have spent years protecting the same secret. Your pulse quickened again. You recognized the place immediately. It wasn't random. It was connected to one memory you had almost forgotten completely. A memory involving the person you loved long before either of you understood how important that ordinary day would eventually become. Then your phone vibrated. Another unknown number. This message was shorter than all the others. Don't come alone. Before you could process those words, another notification arrived from a different sender. Whatever happens tomorrow, don't leave before the last person speaks. The messages stopped. Complete silence returned. But somewhere else, another silence had just been broken. The person who had quietly apologized reached into their coat and removed a small metal key. "I've been keeping this for years." "What does it open?" "A place filled with answers." "Why give it to me now?" "Because it never belonged to me." The key changed hands. Neither person smiled. Both understood that opening whatever it unlocked would reveal far more than anyone had expected. And at that exact moment, someone watching everything from a distance quietly whispered into a phone, "They're all moving exactly where the truth has been waiting. They're all moving exactly where the truth has been waiting." The voice on the phone remained calm, almost detached, before the call ended without another word. The person holding the device slipped it back into a pocket and continued watching from the shadows. They weren't following anyone out of fear or suspicion. They were waiting for the exact moment when every hidden path finally crossed. For years they had watched separate lives move like distant rivers, each carrying its own joys, disappointments, unanswered questions, and quiet sacrifices. Now those rivers were flowing toward the same destination, and nothing could stop them. Not because fate demanded it, but because every decision made in silence had slowly brought them here. The remarkable part was that none of the people involved fully understood how long this moment had been preparing itself. Morning arrived with unusual stillness. You woke before the alarm, unable to shake the feeling that the coming evening already existed somewhere ahead of you, waiting patiently. The mysterious map rested on the table exactly where you had left it. Beside it lay the anonymous letter whose words had refused to leave your thoughts. You read the first sentence again. Someone finally found the courage to walk away from the life they were expected to live. It felt different now. Less mysterious. More personal. You suddenly realized the letter had never accused anyone. It had never encouraged revenge or regret. Instead, it quietly invited understanding. That realization unsettled you because understanding is often far more difficult than choosing sides. Across town, the person you loved stood before an old wooden door hidden behind climbing vines at the edge of a property almost nobody visited anymore. The small metal key rested heavily in their hand. For years they had unknowingly passed this place without noticing it. Today every step felt strangely familiar, as though memory recognized the path before conscious thought could explain why. They inserted the key. It turned smoothly, as if it had been waiting for this exact touch. The door opened with a slow creak, revealing a room untouched by time. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight. Shelves lined the walls. Old journals, neatly arranged boxes, framed photographs, and carefully labeled folders filled the room. Nothing appeared random. Everything had been preserved with deliberate care. At the center stood a single wooden table. On it rested one sealed box. Across the lid someone had written only 6 words. Open only after choosing freedom. Their heartbeat quickened. They had already chosen. Slowly they lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of letters. Every one of them addressed to a different person. Some had names they recognized immediately. Others belonged to people they had never met. One envelope rested separately from all the others. It contained no name. Only 2 words. The truth. Before they could reach for it, another sound echoed through the room. Footsteps. Someone else had entered. The elderly woman stood quietly in the doorway, her expression carrying neither surprise nor fear. She simply smiled with tired kindness. "I wondered whether you would come alone." The person you loved looked stunned. "You knew about this place?" She nodded. "Long before you were born." They stared at her, searching for explanations. She slowly walked toward the table and gently placed her hand on the unopened envelope. "Your grandfather built this room." Confusion deepened. Why would he hide something like this? Her eyes softened. Because he believed some truths become dangerous when people are more interested in protecting appearances than protecting hearts. The words settled over the room like quiet rain. You, meanwhile, had decided to follow the map despite every logical reason telling you not to. The location wasn't far, yet the journey somehow felt longer than usual. Familiar streets seemed unfamiliar today. Every traffic light lasted slightly too long. Every passing face made you wonder whether someone else knew something you didn't. As the destination finally came into view, your footsteps slowed. It was an old community hall, closed for years after being replaced by a newer building. You remembered coming here once, long ago, though the memory remained frustratingly incomplete. Children's laughter. Folding chairs. Someone playing music. The scent of coffee. And one conversation you had never fully understood. You stepped inside. Dust covered most of the floor except for a narrow path leading toward the stage. Someone had been here recently. The silence felt intentional. Not abandoned. Waiting. On the front row rested another envelope. This one carried your full name. Your hands trembled slightly as you opened it. Inside was a single photograph. You stared at it without speaking. It showed a gathering from many years earlier. Dozens of smiling faces filled the frame. Near the edge stood you. Not alone. Standing only a few feet away was the person you loved. Neither of you was looking at the camera. Instead, both of you were looking toward each other. You searched your memory desperately. You couldn't remember that moment. You couldn't even remember anyone taking the photograph. On the back someone had written another sentence. You met much earlier than either of you remembers. The room suddenly felt smaller. At that exact moment, inside the hidden room, the elderly woman carefully unfolded the envelope marked "The Truth." There was no dramatic confession waiting inside. Instead, there was a handwritten journal entry dated nearly 25 years earlier. It began, "If anyone ever finds this, understand one thing before judging anyone. Every generation quietly teaches the next generation what love looks like. Some teach freedom. Others teach fear. Most don't even realize which lesson they're passing forward." The person you loved continued reading. The journal described family expectations stretching back decades. People abandoning dreams to preserve peace. Marriages chosen to satisfy others. Careers accepted to avoid disappointing parents. Friendships sacrificed because they challenged comfortable traditions. Then one paragraph stopped everything. "I pray that one day someone in this family becomes brave enough to end this cycle. They will probably be misunderstood. They may even be blamed. But years later everyone will finally understand they were never destroying the family. They were rescuing it." Tears filled their eyes. The elderly woman quietly whispered, "Your grandfather wrote those words the week before he died. He knew. He lived it. Why didn't anyone tell me?" Because everyone was too busy protecting the story they wished had been true. Silence returned. Not painful silence. Healing silence. The kind that appears after something heavy finally finds its proper name. Back at the community hall, another door slowly opened behind you. You turned immediately. 3 people entered. The first was the older man from the cafe. The second was the visitor who had delivered the first forgotten letter. The third stopped you completely. It was the person who had quietly walked away from someone so important. Neither of you spoke. For a long moment, every unanswered question seemed suspended between your eyes. Finally, they smiled. Not because everything had become simple. Because pretending had finally ended. Before either of you could move, the older man stepped forward. There are things both of you deserve to know. He placed a worn notebook onto a nearby table. I've carried this for 18 years. You looked at him in disbelief. 18? He nodded. It was given to me with one instruction. What instruction? Don't open it until the two people mentioned inside are standing in the same room willingly. Your heartbeat became almost unbearable. He slowly opened the notebook. The first page contained only one sentence. If you're reading this together, then neither of you arrived here by accident. Every person in the room fell silent. The following pages revealed something astonishing. Years earlier, long before either of you understood your own paths, your lives had crossed repeatedly without either of you noticing. The same school event. The same charity fundraiser. The same bookstore. The same hospital waiting room. The same train platform. The same community celebration. Each encounter separated by only minutes. Sometimes by seconds. Every page documented another near meeting. Another invisible intersection. Another chance that quietly slipped away before either of you recognized its importance. The notebook ended with one final observation written in careful handwriting. Their lives keep finding each other because neither of them is meant to become who they truly are alone. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. The room itself seemed to understand the weight of what had just been uncovered. Then, just as everyone believed the greatest revelation had finally arrived, the elderly woman entered carrying the wooden box from the hidden room. She looked directly at you. Then at the person you loved. Very gently she said, "Everything you've learned today explains the past." She carefully opened the box one final time. But none of it explains why someone has been secretly arranging every meeting you've had for nearly 20 years. The air left the room. Because buried beneath the letters was a recent photograph. Taken only 3 weeks earlier. A photograph of both of you. Neither of you had ever seen the camera. And on the back, written in fresh ink, were 8 chilling words. The final meeting was never meant to be hidden. The final meeting was never meant to be hidden. Those words settled over the room with a weight no one could immediately understand. Nobody reached for the photograph. Nobody asked who had taken it. Everyone simply stared at the fresh handwriting on the back as though answering even a single question too quickly might destroy the fragile truth that had finally begun to emerge. The silence was different now. Earlier it had been filled with uncertainty. This silence carried recognition. Something that had lived beneath years of coincidence was finally standing in plain sight. The older man slowly picked up the photograph and turned it over again before placing it carefully on the table. "This picture wasn't left here to frighten either of you," he said quietly. "It was left here so neither of you would keep calling everything a coincidence." His voice remained calm, but his eyes revealed something deeper. Relief. The kind of relief carried by someone who had protected a promise for so many years that they had almost forgotten what life felt like without its weight. You looked toward the person you loved. For the first time, there was nothing hidden between you. No assumptions. No expectations. No unfinished conversations pretending to be complete. Just honesty. Sometimes honesty arrives quietly after years of noise. Sometimes it changes everything without raising its voice. The person you loved finally stepped closer. I thought walking away would answer my questions. You remained silent. It didn't. Another pause. It only showed me I had been asking the wrong ones. You felt your heartbeat slow. What was the right question? They smiled gently. Not who expected me to stay. Their eyes met yours. But who allowed me to become myself. The room remained perfectly still. No dramatic applause. No emotional interruption. Only the quiet understanding that some truths deserve silence more than celebration. The elderly woman slowly opened one final compartment hidden beneath the wooden box. None of the others had noticed it before. Inside rested a small leather journal tied with a faded ribbon. She untied it with careful hands. "This," she whispered, "was the last thing your grandfather asked me to protect." She opened to the final page. Unlike the previous entries, this one had never been dated. It simply read, "If you're reading this, then the cycle has already been broken. Don't waste another moment searching for someone to blame." Every person in this story acted according to the fears they inherited. Some feared rejection. Some feared loneliness. Some feared disappointing people they loved. Forgive them. Not because they were always right, but because carrying their fear into your future would only begin the cycle again. Nobody moved. The words reached every person differently. The one who had been left behind quietly lowered their head. For the first time since the painful goodbye, they stopped defending themselves. They finally understood that love cannot survive where another person's identity must constantly be negotiated. With slow steps, they walked toward the person you loved. I kept asking why you left. No reply came. I should have been asking what made you feel you had to. Tears filled their eyes. I'm sorry. There was no anger waiting. No desire for revenge. Only compassion. The person you loved gently nodded. I forgive you. Those 3 words carried years of healing inside them. Not because they erased the past. Because they finally released it. The older man quietly closed the notebook that had documented nearly 2 decades of invisible intersections. You've all been looking backward long enough. Everyone turned toward him. Come outside. One by one, they stepped beyond the old community hall. The evening sun was beginning to disappear beyond the horizon. Golden light stretched across the quiet field where children had once played years earlier. Nothing extraordinary seemed to be happening. Yet everything felt different. The elderly woman smiled toward the fading sunlight. Do you know why this place was chosen? Nobody answered. Because this was the first place where your lives crossed. She pointed toward an old oak tree standing alone at the edge of the field. You were both here. You searched your memory again. Fragments returned. A balloon drifting into the sky. Someone laughing. A child running too fast. A gentle voice saying, "Careful." Then suddenly. You remembered. Not clearly. Just enough. You remembered turning around. You remembered seeing someone smiling before both of you were called in opposite directions. You had forgotten the face. But not the feeling. The person you loved slowly closed their eyes. I remember it too. Neither of you had realized the memory had remained alive beneath years of ordinary life. Some moments never disappear. They simply wait until the heart becomes ready to recognize them. The elderly woman quietly handed you one final folded piece of paper. There is only one sentence inside. You opened it. The handwriting matched every previous letter. It read, "The greatest love stories are rarely built by perfect timing. They are built by people who become the right version of themselves before they finally meet without fear." You looked up. The person you loved was already looking at you. Not searching for promises. Not asking for certainty. Simply present. Completely. For the first time. The wind moved gently through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, church bells softly echoed across the evening. No one hurried to speak. No one tried to force the future into existence. Because everyone finally understood something that had been hidden beneath every mystery, every letter, every photograph, every missed meeting, every unexpected goodbye, and every silent decision. The greatest secret had never been the identity of the important person who had been left behind. It had been the reason they were left behind. Not for another relationship. Not for a dramatic ending. Not because someone new seemed more exciting. But because there comes a moment in every life when choosing truth becomes more important than protecting familiarity. That single decision quietly changes every future that follows. The person you loved took one careful step forward. So. Their voice carried peace instead of uncertainty. What happens now? You smiled. For the first time. You looked toward the open road stretching beyond the old field. We don't follow someone else's map. A quiet laugh escaped both of you. The tension that had followed everyone for so many years seemed to disappear into the evening breeze. The older man placed the notebook back inside the wooden box. The elderly woman gently closed its lid. Neither object would be needed again. Their purpose had been fulfilled. The hidden room would remain where it had always been. The letters would become memories. The photographs would become reminders. The unanswered questions would finally become understanding. As everyone slowly walked away together, the setting sun painted the sky with warm shades of gold and deep blue. No cameras recorded the moment. No audience applauded. No headlines announced what had happened. To the rest of the world, it was simply another ordinary evening. But for those who stood there, it was the first evening in many years that no one was pretending to be someone they were not. Long after everyone had disappeared down separate paths, the wind quietly turned over one forgotten page that had slipped from the journal. Nobody saw it. Nobody picked it up. Yet the final sentence remained there beneath the fading light. It read, "The people meant for your future will never ask you to abandon your truth in order to keep their place in your life. And when you finally choose the courage to become yourself, every goodbye that once broke your heart will reveal that it was only making room for the life that had been patiently walking toward you all along."